Sorry. Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on demand responsive transport, the Australian experience, organized by the ITE ANZ Australia and New Zealand section of the Institute of Transportation Engineers. I am Cristian Jara, and I will be the moderator of this session. Thank you for taking time out and being here today. First of all, we acknowledge the Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first inhabitants of the nation and the traditional custodians of the lands where we live, learn, and work. We pay our respects to elders, past, present, and emerging. We acknowledge and respect the Treaty of Waitangi and Maori as the original people of Aotearoa, New Zealand, and we acknowledge people of Indigenous descent who are with us today. ITE ANZ is a section of the Institute of Transportation Engineers based in Australia and New Zealand. And as an overview, the ITE ANZ is an international membership association of transport professionals who work to improve mobility and safety for all transportation system users and help build smart and livable communities. And on behalf of ITE, I also would like to acknowledge our generous sponsor, who by their financial support not only support the operations of ITE ANZ, but also share in our ethos to improve transport and create a better world. We are proud to have Austraffic as our platinum sponsor, sponsoring our student award. We are proud to have TrafficWorks sponsoring our President's Dinner and Postgraduate Award. We are proud to have Cedra Solutions. And for the sponsoring the annual breakfast, we are proud to have RACV Club. Also, we would like to acknowledge our corporate sponsors, Arab and O'Brien Traffic. Sorry, Arab, O'Brien Traffic, and Movement and Place Consulting. ITE ANZ is always open to partner with you and your respective companies. So if your company is interested in supporting the work of the ITE ANZ and partnering as a leader in the field of transport, please get in touch for an obligation-free conversation to find out more. So also special thanks to the organizing committee, did an amazing job setting up the webinar and reaching out to invite the speakers that we have today, to Danielle, David, Sarah, Matt, and Danielle. Just some basic housekeeping notes before we kickstart. Please keep your microphones on mute. We won't be taking questions during the presentation. However, if you would like to ask a question, please feel free to drop it into the chat box at any time during the presentation, and they will be addressed at the end in a dedicated Q&A session. We'll be taking a survey at the end of the webinar, and we kindly appreciate if you can take 2 minutes of your time to fill out the survey. The link will be dropped on the chat later. So without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to open the webinar and introduce our first speaker, Juan Carbonell. Juan leads the Asia Pacific territory for MoveIt, the world's largest urban mobility platform with over 1 billion users in 112 countries. He believes that the future of transport is getting closer to your customer through a deeper understanding of their needs and behaviors. With advances in mobility as a service, the mobile phone technology, we are closer than ever to create urban areas where shared, convenient, and accessible mobility will be available for everyone. It's a future that Juan is actively working to bring forward. Juan's career spans 18 years through a range of disciplines, 12 of those years in the transport industry. Over the past 6 years, he's designed and delivered complex programs for government and private businesses across the region. Prior to joining MoveIt, Juan was the managing director of RouteMatch, an Uber company, and directed a program for WestConnex, Australia's top road infrastructure project. He also delivered the Transport for New South Wales CTAPS project, the largest demand responsive transport service in the Southern Hemisphere. with over 1,300 vehicles. So thanks, Juan, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll share my screen now.
Yeah.
Excellent. And hopefully everybody can see this okay.
Yeah, all good.
Very good. Thank you very much. So also, thank you so much for having me today. As Christian mentioned, my name is Juan Carbonell, and I look after the Move It office for APAC. We are based in Sydney, Australia for the time being, and we're doing business now from Japan through to Singapore, and of course all the way here to Australia and New Zealand, which I'll today share a little bit more on those projects with you to kind of share more on the local future of mobility as a service and also demand responsive transport. Quickly, just a quick introduction to Move It. You might be asking, who the hell is Move It, or what do we do? I know that I had never heard of Move It 2 years ago when I was first hired, and it's kind of a quiet champion in the public transport journey planning space. It is the simplest and most intuitive mobility app in the world. We are currently available in about 26 different cities in Australia and New Zealand, and that one app, of course, gets you to many different places around the world. So the idea is not just public transport information being shown to you from a journey planner perspective, but all different forms of local available mobility shown as well. And I'll jump into some of our partnerships in just a moment with Bird and Uber and several others. In terms of scale, we have about 1.1 billion users around the world in 112 countries. We're available in 3,500 cities and have integrated with over 400 micromobility providers here in the local Australian territory. So in the last 12 months, we've integrated with Uber, Ola. We're having conversations with Didi, Beam, Bird, Neuron from an e-bike and e-scooter perspective. Smart Parking with Ubi Park and several others. Our conversations that we're having now and pulling them into the umbrella as well. So you truly get the full multimodal experience when you plan that journey from A to B. In terms of our strategic customers, Apple Maps, Microsoft, TomTom, Uber, as you see here in your respective cities. If you ever see Uber Plus Transit, where you open up the Uber app and you get a Uber first mile transit option to public transport, it's actually Move It creating those journey plans and feeding that back through. So we actually, for many of the largest companies in the world, provide this integrated journey planning experience, and there's going to be some more announcements at the end of this year with major governments here in Australia further pushing mobility as a service and journey planning here in Australia as well. So let's jump straight into demand responsive transport and FlexiRide. And so before we jump into the FlexiRide case study, just wanted to make sure that everyone is aligned with what is on-demand transport, a form of demand responsive transport. And traditionally, of course, we're all very comfortable and understand the concept of the bus with its static schedule, its static route, obviously moving large volumes of people in a short period of time on shared road infrastructure. And on the flip side, we know the taxi quite well, dynamic routing on call whenever you need it. It's private, it can be relatively expensive, not necessarily the most efficient way of moving people from A to B. In this new paradigm of demand responsive transport and on-demand, we sit in the middle where you could have a dynamic route and then hail, for example, in real time. But you could even have what we like to call a smart shuttle, which is a fixed route. The timetables and the runs themselves are actually only turned on when someone books into them as well. So you can actually play a little bit more with a route or a scheduled timetable. And ultimately, the idea is to use that as a tool to aggregate more people and push them all, head them in the same direction. So most recently in the Melbourne context, you may have heard of an on-demand trial that's been happening there called FlexiRide. FlexiRide is run actually by Ventura Bus. And it started off in Rowville and since then has now expanded into Lilydale, Morrellbark, and Croydon. That whole service is now called Churnside Park. So there's 4 actual service areas out there now that are delivering demand responsive services under the one FlexiRide app and umbrella for the Department of Transport. I'm going to share with you a little bit more on this case study and how it converted existing telebus routes into an on-demand service, so kind of removing the route and picking up people at virtual stops, so not necessarily at a bus stop, but somewhere that is safe and secure, that a kind of MIDI 32 person vehicle could actually stop and pick somebody up at, and how that service has actually revolutionized the existing telebus service that was there and has increased patronage and created a much happier service, so to speak. So just fairly quickly, for those of you that maybe aren't as familiar in the Melbourne context, so Rowville is pretty much in a straight line to the CBD, straight out to the east in the outer metro kind of area. And this service area that you see on the right is about 10 kilometers squared. That replaced actually 3 telebus service routes. And the idea there from a design perspective is, we're not competing with taxis, we're not competing with Ubers. We're trying to create aggregation, people heading in the same direction to create better efficiencies from the service. So what we did is on the northeast hand side, we are servicing there the Fern Tree Gully train station. And then on the kind of southwest side of that zone, we're servicing the Stud Park Shopping Center. And either your origin or your destination needs to start or end at one of those 2 points. So we call that a curb to hub model, which then forces aggregation. As people head in that same direction, we pick them up and we drop them off, getting more and more people moving efficiently from that side. So I'm going to share more on that case study in just a moment. Lilydale and this kind of what we call Churnside Park, the new service areas that you see on the left-hand side, that's much larger. I think that's about 20 to 25 square kilometers with currently 9 contracted vehicles operating that service. Rowville had 4 contracted vehicles. And so here, even though it's one large area, we've actually created these kind of boundaries, as you see there, to manage the demand of people trying to book east to west, as you can see there, north to south, to try to quarantine and better manage and create those efficiencies of people heading to, let's say, the Churnside Park Shopping Center or the Lilydale Shopping Center as well. And so this project is still relatively new. It's been out for about a month, and I'll share with you some of the local insights on that now as well. So far in those 4 service areas, 8 routes have been replaced. The telebus services 1 to 9 are all now part of the new on-demand service. As part of the Lilydale Churnside Park service, we also incorporated what was called the Lilydale Loop, which was on that kind of northeast side. That was a very circular, circuitous bus route, has now been incorporated into on-demand as well. The FlexiRide app and the service itself is available to be booked via the application, which gives you an enhanced experience. So as you book in through the app, you get to see when a vehicle is assigned to you. You also get an SMS of who your driver is and when to expect the vehicle. You get a lot better real-time information, of course, historical view of your trips, etc., all become available. But if, let's say, you are elderly or technologically disenfranchised, you do not want to use a mobile phone, you can still dial in the way that the traditional telebus used to. You can book that trip, and then you will be, waiting at a particular street corner where you are usually picked up at a particular time to be picked up from that service. So there's both the traditional way, but of course the newer technologically enabled way as well. There are home pickups for those particularly with mobility issues that can't make it to the bus stop. You have the ability to request a pickup from home, and you will be picked up from home with an elevated level of service. The pickup times can be flexible, so you can choose if you want to repeat a pickup during particular days of the week, or you could also then say, pick me up around the particular time, and we might, due to aggregation, say plus or 5 minutes or less than 5 minutes, for example, to pick you up and to make sure that you're picked up in time. As I quickly mentioned, this works on a virtual stop model. So the idea is that we use existing bus stop infrastructure, but we also have created a matrix of about 200 or so plus virtual stops. So places that are deemed safe by the Ventura team, they drive to each of the recommended spots and they check to make sure that their vehicle can stop there, pick someone up safely, and continue to move on. And that, of course, makes catchment a lot better, because traditionally with a bus stop, you had to walk as far as your first point of contact to the public transport network. With virtual stops, the idea is that you can typically walk no more than 150 meters on average, is what we see in these different services, before you are then picked up and taken to your final destination. And one thing that's really interesting in the Department of Transport flavor of on-demand that they've created through FlexiRide is that the hard constraint is that the Department of Transport will not pay $1 more for the operating contract that's been kind of assigned for that particular route or region. So everything that we do has to be cost neutral. Yes, there is a technology uplift, if you want to call it that, where they've invested in the tech to bring it all together. But the OPEX that's been assigned to the individual services, they won't add $1 more. So it has to be creating more efficiencies within the boundaries. And so Rowville was launched in December of 2020, and the new Lilydale Churnside Park service was launched earlier in October. With Rowville, as you can see here on the left-hand side, the previous metrics, you were looking at typically about 40 to 50 minutes wait time for that telebus service to do its kind of loop and then come back to pick you up. Travel time on average was close to about 30 minutes, and patronage was about 40 riders per day. Now, on average, you're seeing about 6.7-minute wait time, 13 minutes travel time on average. And we got close to pre-COVID lockdown on Melbourne, very close to 200 riders per day, still within that same kind of contracted kilometer metric, as I mentioned before, that DOT insisted that the contract stay cost neutral. But now we're kind of hovering closer to about 100 patrons a day in this kind of COVID lockdown state. So so far, it's been deemed a major success, by the Department of Transport, hence why they approved the Churnside Lilydale additional services. And there's more services that will be going live early next year to be announced later this year as well around Melbourne, particularly focused in outer metro and regional Melbourne. So in terms of what really counts, which is how does a passenger feel about this change, this radical change to the bus route they've taken for the last 10, 20, sometimes even 30 years. And so far, and this was literally feedback that was taken from last week, so far the feedback has been overwhelmingly positive. As you can see here across both projects, Rowville and Lilydale, we're seeing about 95% people that have voted trips 5 stars. And as you can see here, there's been over 400 ratings over this kind of week, this period of time. People are really closer to the bus driver in these smaller middies and a more personalized Uber-like DRT service. The bus driver is really the face of the business. So as you can see here, there's been a lot of great comments towards the bus driver, people feeling quite happy and confident with the new service. Ventura was great. They actually called certain individuals, randomly called certain individuals after their first service and after their first week of service, just to gauge how they were feeling about that service. And this, as you can see here, some of the feedback that was provided. So I'm not saying that DRT works perfectly in every circumstance. A bus is still a very powerful tool in moving people. And when it comes to volume in a very short period of time, the bus is king, or of course, rail and light rail and other, considerations in the planner's toolkit. But for, kind of particular areas, DRT is a very exciting and kind of novel concept that can be better explored. So what I wanted to share with you now in the next few minutes is how do we plan a DRT service? How do we take the guesswork out of where a DRT service could be most successful? And so this slide here is actually a slide that was created by the Department of Transport Victoria. I think it tells a good story. As you can see here on the x-axis is basically the number of or the different types of services, as you can see color coded, that deliver transport services. On the left-hand side is the estimated weekday boardings per live bus hour. And so, they have some on-demand services out there, some neighborhood services, shuttles, as you can see, etc. And they have what they like to call a Goldilocks zone, which is just right in the point where you don't have that high a number of patrons, and the kind of frequency of those bus services maybe aren't to the right scratch to really get people to create that compelling and convincing reason to get out of their car. So we don't want a high volume service and replace that with DRT. That's way too costly. On the flip side, anything in that Goldilocks zone and lower might also be primed for a DRT service, but it depends on the area and the local circumstances, and other existing forms of transit available in those areas as well. For consideration, and some work that we also kind of explored with the Department of Transport and with Yara Trams is, how can you, for example, extend heavy rail, light rail networks that move, people, but maybe there's a lack of access to those particular public transport entry points. And so so Move It has millions of users in Melbourne and millions of users in Sydney and Brisbane and other kind of larger cities in Australia. And so we can actually use that data, which is, by the way, de-identified and aggregated, but we can actually use that data to run models of where DRT might actually be most successful based on what the data shows us. So we look at particular qualities from a planner's perspective. And of course, we work with planners on this particular front with Yarra-Tram planners and DOT planners. We look at things like demand peakness. We don't like very peaky services, because then you have to build for the peak and it becomes quite costly as you're buying more vehicles to move smaller volumes of people in these smaller vehicles. So we like relatively flat demand. We like bi-directional demand as well. So people that are commuting to and from work, where we know we're going to get an AM and PM return service for them, is typically going to create a better utilized on-demand service. We look at trip duration by mode. So how long a car trip takes, and the way the Move It app works, we get to see car trips versus other types of trips. And how long a car trip takes, let's say, versus a public transit trip versus, let's say, an active transport trip. And if we see a big disparity between public transit and car, there tends to be a lot of potential there for a demand responsive service to kind of step in and assist and create fill the vacuum, so to speak. But we also look at things like quality of supply, like average first and last mile transit access, the percentage of transit stops within 500 meters of the average person in these particular areas, and the average number of transit services available per hour to a particular person. So this is just a handful of about 20 or 30 different metrics that we use. And we run this literally millions of trips, whether it's pre-COVID or post-COVID. We run this through a big data back office, and that gives us a very cool view of where there's issues with current supply and where DRT could actually be quite useful. Once we kind of pick certain areas to explore, we then design the service area based on heat maps that we have of where people like to reside or where most of the traffic generation is kind of going to or coming from. We then actually run simulations, sometimes 20 or 30 simulations on different scenarios. So as you can see here on this corner, the number of vehicles available versus, let's say, the number of demand per day. We take real origin destination pairs that we grab from the Move It app, and we actually run them different statistical kind of sample sets, and we run them through our simulator to see, hey, what would the quality of service look like for these areas before the service goes live. So we look at confirming the level of supply, establishing what the right level of service is. It doesn't have to be a premium service. It isn't an Uber. It needs to be convenient and shared, but really ultimately try to aggregate as many people on that service as possible. And then we ask other questions like, how do trip behaviors change across the day? Are locals willing to wait potentially for this new service, even if it takes a little bit longer, but still less than their existing service? And there's a lot of just local knowledge that's required from the operators to pull all of this together, as well as, of course, the data supporting some of those decisions. And then ultimately, once that service is live, it's listening to your customers. So we look at literally almost on a daily basis what the customer feedback was day to day, which is what you see here, and the different distributions of ratings. We're very interested in repeating the repeat rides. So ensuring that the customers that are using the service are as much as possible, using that service at least once or more in any given week. And we do a lot of work on trying to foster more people utilizing those services. And we also do a lot of behavioral analysis, as you can see here, around time of day, pickups, drop-offs, and how that all comes together as well. So in a traditional fixed route service, I'm going to skip this slide. In a traditional fixed route service, we're really obviously focused on running the best damn route we possibly can. In our DRT service, it is very much more engaged in what the rider wants, how seasonality impacts utilization, or events that are occurring impacts utilization, and how we're constantly trying to match supply and demand so that we're not spending we're not wasting a kilometer more on moving people to and from those kind of key locations. And the last thing I'll leave with you in the last minute that we have here is how does this all fit into the larger mobility as a service ecosystem? Well, in the Move It world, on demand is just another part of the options that are available to locals in a particular urban area. So you may or may not have heard, so Move It is part of Intel, the Intel family. And just a month and a half ago, the Intel CEO announced the world's first robotaxi, commercial robotaxi fleet launching in Munich, 20 vehicles in next year, as well as in Tel Aviv, 5 vehicles. that's actually going to be running on the same on-demand back office that we're seeing now in FlexiRide, and that's going to be starting as level 4 on-demand, level 4 autonomous services, and then soon to be level 5 in 2022. So this could easily be done in Melbourne. This could easily be done, of course, in Sydney, and that just becomes a first or last mile leg of your journey to ultimately get to the train station or wherever else you need to go. So I'll skip through this case. I'm sorry, guys. If time permitted, I was going to share with you a little bit more on how we do a nationwide MaaS project in the Netherlands, and we've integrated there with 5 public transit operators and 30 micromobility operators. But hopefully, that's a future presentation that I can share with everyone at a later time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Juan. Thank you, Juan, for that interesting presentation. Unfortunately, Juan is not going to be able to stay until the Q&A session. So if you have any questions for him, please raise your hand or put it in the chat. If not, I have some questions, Juan. Yes. So for example, you said that some of the simulations you use for the DRT are based on HERE maps data, right? Are these simulations biased on who is using the HERE maps, right? Because not all of the population or all of the age groups are using HERE maps, right? Some of them are excluded from it. So you would say these simulations are biased, and how can you manage that?
It's a great question. And so just to be clear, it's actually all MOVEit data that we use, real origin destination pairs that we grab from the MOVEit consumer app, where millions of people use that, for example, in Melbourne. There is a bias, two very well-known biases. First of all is the age restrictions of using technology. So normally people younger than 12 years old or those, let's say, over 70, 75 years old aren't well represented. And number 2, there's a natural bias in the data set because people that download MOVEit use public transit. That's why they download the MOVEit app. So there's a calibration process before any simulation occurs. There's a calibration process where we use existing ticketing data where that's available, where we use existing census data and household survey data to calibrate it across the entire population set. And then from there, we run the simulations, typically with an R factor, like a calibration factor of, and 0.95 or somewhere around there. We can get to 95% accuracy with a lot of these simulations.
Okay, thank you. There's a question in the chat from Arnab. He said, just curious, when replacing fixed route services with on-demand services, what is the cost differential and how do you compare levels of service across fixed and on-demand networks?
That's a really great question. So just going back to one of the previous points that I made is, in this new generation of DRT and on-demand projects that are taking place, governments aren't going to spend $1 more for an on-demand service in terms of the OPEX, the operating cost of running that service. So that includes the wear of the vehicles, the fuel, the maintenance, and then of course the contracted number of kilometers. So in Melbourne, the DOT is actually not paying $1 more on that particular service. There is a technology uplift, so it depends on the size of the service area, and then of course the complexity of that area. That could be anywhere from like $100,000 to $200,000 or $300,000 per service area, and that gets cheaper, of course, the more it scales. But that's it. That's a capital uplift, capital cost, and you're done. So in terms of the cost differential, we're actually right now more profitable running as an on-demand service than the fixed route service was previously, from a Ventura perspective. And as you've seen, with an elevated level of service, with customers more engaged, really happy, and patronage, growing sometimes multitudes more than what was originally there. And how do you compare levels of service across fixed and on-demand? Same kind of considerations. You're looking at number of kilometers per passengers moved. You're looking now at qualitative factors of happiness. So, as I was showing you there, the ratings, the feedback, and what people are sharing there. We actually do quarterly surveys as well. So we ask things like, when you use DRT services, do you connect into a bus, train, other types of modes, etc. So we get a lot of softer data that previously would have been more difficult to get through the app as well. But ultimately, it comes down to cost per passenger per kilometer, the classic kind of bus metric, and comparing that like for like in DRT world versus fixed route world.
Yeah. Okay. I have another question. In one of your slides, you mentioned that in Rowville there was an improvement in waiting times from 40 to 50 minutes to 6.7 minutes.
Yeah.
So this 40 to 50 minutes, is this like active waiting time, like in the bus stop? So people actually wait 40 to 50 minutes
No.
using telebus, or?
No, that's a good question. So that was basically the headways of the service. So
Oh, all right.
people waiting at the bus stop could be 5, 10, 20 minutes. Typically, the elderly feel more comfortable, waiting at the bus stop for the bus to come, so they might have waited a bit longer. But previously, the headways was somewhere around that 40 to 50 minute mark, and then people could wait that long at points to wait for the next bus to come, etc. So now they can see when their bus is coming. They get an SMS when that vehicle is 2 or 3 minutes away with the license plate of the vehicle and an ETA of when their vehicle should get to the final destination. So if you have a phone, you get a much more enriched experience. If you're a kind of phone user, you get the same traditional experience you had before the advent of the flexi ride service.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
There's another question in the chat. If
Yep.
the patronage keeps growing and exceeds the current vehicle capacity, can the DRT services still be cost neutral?
That is a very great question, Rico. So this is where there is definitely a cliff that we're studying and we're constantly looking at. So the key factors, if you can't change the number of vehicles and you can't change the number of kilometers, the thing that starts to give a bit is the amount of time that you wait. And so that is a very delicate dance. So we're looking now in the post-COVID world, like once people get out of lockdown, where to keep it cost neutral and to keep the kilometers down, you have to potentially wait at certain points like the Rowville or the Stud Park Shopping Center or the Ferntree Gully train station to further aggregate. You might have people waiting 25 minutes where before they used to wait 10 minutes when there was less demand. How do people respond to that? So there's this very delicate balance of, as we see the numbers going up, we look at the wait time that people on average are waiting for, and then we look at sentiment. And we're kind of managing that very delicately. And there will come a point, and it could be in the next 6 months where it's going to crack, where people are going to go, I'm waiting too long, this is making me unhappy. We're going to see the ratings going down, and at that point in time, we then intend to flick the switch with DOT to potentially add an additional vehicle and scale up. The second thing to consider is that DRT, the biggest compliment you can play to a DRT service is when you replan it and you put a fixed route back in. So it becomes like a backbone service. So there's also a consideration of, hey, DRT does get really expensive. If you move that many more people, you can't keep throwing vehicles at it. How can we replan an area to feed in potentially to a trunk service? And then once again, like move people in frequency to that high volume trunk service, whether it's a bus rapid transit line or some other consideration, but then keep DRT light and nimble where it's cost effective. So hopefully that answers that question.
Yeah, okay. So James Edwards asked, you spoke of pickup locations. How much variety is there in destinations? I assume it's related to the virtual stops.
Yeah. So we will. So we have an algorithm that we've developed over the last 3 or 4 years that looks at a particular area, and then it looks at stuff like elevation and other kind of demand consideration, and it creates like a suggested matrix of virtual stops, which we then give to Ventura, and their people on the ground or the operator, and their people on the ground will actually qualify each and every one over the period of a week to see, can someone access it? What if someone's elderly? Is it safe? For them to get on board with the vehicle, etc. And so there is literally no limitations except for in terms of where the virtual stops could be, except for that it's not like in a turning area, that it's obviously in a place that has a lot of clearance around the bus so that it's safe. And then of course where there's shelter, they're preferred pickup spots. But at this point in time, there is no such like limitation. So the variety is endless in terms of like where they could be once they get qualified by the operator.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, there's no more questions on the chat. Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Juan. It has been a really interesting presentation, and the question has been really interesting too.
Thank you.
So
Thank you for sharing your time with me. I appreciate it.
Okay, so for our next presentation, I'm glad to introduce Yale Wong. Yale is an international expert in transport policy, planning, operations, and management, with specializations in technology, innovation, governance, and institutional reform. As principal at the boutique advisory Dr. Transportation, Jill works behind the scenes with some of the world's largest government, public transport, micromobility, startups, and trade associations on strategy, market entry, business transformation, research, and service delivery. Jill holds additional positions on the ANZ Market Lead at the Cities Forum and an honorary associate at the Institute of Transport and Logistic Studies. Jill is a frequent keynote speaker, media commentator, and powerful industry advocate, having won the David Willis Prize in 2018, the ITLS Research Prize in 2018, the ITS Young Professional Award in 2019, and representing Australia as the Youth Ambassador to the ITS World Congress in 2019. Over to you, Yale.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Christian, and fantastic to see such a large complement of people and lots of familiar names on our Tuesday afternoon today. I might add, thanks for that terrific introduction. I might add, as a bit of an aside, Christian, apart from his role at Melbourne City Council and also an ITE, has a bright spark in a society that I've chaired called Young Transport Professionals Next Gen. So it's fantastic to follow Juan in this webinar sort of sequence. Juan gave a really good, I think, playbook around how to implement a very good demand responsive transport systems. And what I want to do is take a step back and look at some big picture issues around when and where might DRT be the best solution, and actually take a more of a global and historic view in terms of helping to inform some strategies and also a blueprint for Melbourne. As Christian said, I've been an academic in that sector for quite a number of years, and in the past couple of years, I've been running a boutique transport advisory very quickly with partners and with my associates. There's three buckets of work that I'm most involved in around it: business and commercial, tender strategy, hyperlocalization, partnerships, and the like, particularly in the bus and coach, micromobility and SaaS providers, research and policy as well. I recently completed a MAS feasibility study for a major government client in Victoria, of which Juan participated as an interview participant. And finally, in international development, helping in technical assistance and also capacity building for multilateral organizations in a couple of markets, particularly India and Southeast Asia. So conceptualizing DRT, DRT, you might have heard the terms perhaps in the end of the last century called unconventional modes, and later on also DRT on demand, flexible transport systems, paratransit, and these days also microtransit from the Silicon Valley crowd that have been using those terms. And DRT it's so vast. It actually encompasses far more than we might give credit to. In the dark sort of cube that you can see, that's the fixed scheduled public transport network we often think about: tram, train, bus, light rail, ferries, and the like. But this entire other grey box is this entire infinite continuum, almost this spectrum around where DRT may or may not fit. DRT is far more than just flexible routes and schedules, and also stops as well when we do that comparison with fixed route, but also on some other dimensions around business formality and also competition, regulation as well. I'll talk in this presentation a bit about contractors versus commercial DRT. There's so many different ways, and maybe a lot of services that we are aware of at the moment that are actually disguising themselves as DRT, but being packaged or offered in other ways. So looking at first principles, I'm especially interested in terms of how public transport systems under, say, a full market resolution scenario, in the absence of regulation, organically or naturally evolve and transform. And earlier in my career, I spent quite a bit of time in sub-Saharan Africa, actually. And these are places where you see these types of vehicles. So the minibus taxis in South Africa, the daladallas in Tanzania, the matatus in Kenya, for instance, motorized three-wheelers in South Asia, the angkos in Indonesia, if you like. And looking at the history around how they have actually developed, a lot of them, they started off very much like DRT type services in much smaller vehicles, sedans, and they've grown to combis, and now these minivans, minibuses, and the like. And as you go through, there seems to be this natural organic convergence towards consolidation of routes. You can see some examples here. Prices, the way individual agents are actually brought together to derive greater efficiency in transport networks. Big interchanges pop up as well. This is an example from Cape Town. There's 600 different routes, minibus taxi ones that are operating, not necessarily fixed like the way that we know in Australia, but certainly much more on the fixed side than the demand responsive side that we might often think about in the entire DRT spectrum. And there are deviations, obviously, linked to rat running or pickups in shoulder demand and the like. And it's a very similar story in, say, Nairobi in Kenya. This is the digital matatu kind of project. So we can see from these informal systems, in terms of this organic growth and development, that what makes them successful is probably not their demand responsiveness, but it's their permanence. They don't take people from door to door. They don't go and serve every nook and cranny. They make people walk to major arterials to access the service. And you can see the vehicles are growing larger. They're becoming more rigid as well. Now, of course, we're in a bit of a different environment in terms of Melbourne, the urban structure, land uses, also the advent of new technologies such as the Move It solution, which might make things very different. But it's still important to note, I think, that cities are urban environments where road space is a dense commodity, and public transport is the only efficient way to move a lot of people, because you're able to reach economies of scale by putting people onto a single vehicle. Of course, when there's too much consolidation, you run into first and last mile issues, and then it does kind of become a bit of a circular problem. DRT interfaces with fixed route services in all of those developing country scenarios as well. And we heard from Juan around different kind of the what was it called, the curve to hub model, the interchange, destination specific, network, and substitute. I'll add two ways of thinking about these dimensions. We often talk about the spatial dimension around how the DRT might serve as a first and last mile feeder, supporting access and egress, but equally so, and we see a lot of this in sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, but also on the temporal dimension, where DRT might actually serve as a peak top-up. So we have a sort of that patronage variation through the diurnal cycle through the day, and you can actually use a lot of these services to help reduce the vehicle requirements that are needed on your formal or the fixed modes as well. So a couple of sort of lessons or things to think about when we think about that integration level. We saw from the that nice benchmarking graph sort of from Juan in terms of the productivity of bus routes, and in Melbourne they are quite notoriously bad. We saw the Goldilocks zone. Infrastructure Victoria has the benchmark. I think it's 50 boardings per revenue vehicle hour, and the only ones that see that are smart bus and some of the university shuttles and a few others. Most bus routes perform very poorly, and the question needs to be asked: does that mean we replace that with DRT? Does that mean we do something else, or do we start upstream? Do we look at some other root causes? Maybe a redesign or better design might be warranted. DRT is not new to Melbourne, and certainly not new to the world, as I've shown. DRT in its dial ride incarnation, the pen and paper sort of format has been there's been a lot of them over a number of decades. The most one, the Telebus, has been the only one that has been able to endure test of time. It was started by John Usher. He's a big giant in the industry as a consultant these days, but in the Croydon bus company, which became Invicta, Brenda, and Ventura these days, and pretty much all the way until the end of last year when FlexiRide popped in. It's a pen and paper service, but what I think was able to help it endure is that if you look at the characteristics of FlexiRide, and I give Peter Parker full credit for this table, which is from his blog, one of my favorite Twitter followers. But there's a lot of there's a lot of rigidity in terms of that telebus concept. I think Peter's going to give more of a critique around the Roadville FlexiBus deployment, but I do want to say one thing. It's the theme around: are you competing or complementing with your fixed route? Roadville is an extreme political hot potato. Pretty much from when it started, it's been promised a rail line that it never got. It's never got a full bus service that actually meets policy headways, for instance, frequency, span, coverage, directness. You can see it competes, and that's very problematic. So it's something to think about. And also, I guess, network reform is extremely difficult everywhere, but especially in Melbourne. But when it comes time for maybe something that has a technology interface into it, a lot of stakeholders get very excited, and it becomes politically palpable. And oftentimes, it doesn't even go to community consultation either. So that's the element of technological determinism that I think has we need to transcend, and we need more clarity of purpose in what we're doing. We can't sort of, many stakeholders, they sort of think on demand, good, fixed route, bad. So there's a lot of issues in there. There's confounding of vehicle size with route flexibility. People just associate the reliability and efficiency issues with fixed route with the fixed route elements rather than other things. It might be right of way, it could be a whole host of different factors. I draw your attention to this paper from Graham Curry, professor at Monash University, which is quite well cited. It showed that half of all DRTs in the world have failed, and these are some of the issues that we have to be concerned with. So we have to be very cautious in terms of how we step forward to in that. And also and this one, it could be up for debate, but maybe just as a bit of a food for thought, the paper also found that technology has not brought costs down. So there might be a whole host of reasons for that one. New South Wales has seen across the world one of the most systematic and comprehensive deployments of a range of DRT services in metro, outer metro, and rural and regional as well. The trials are more or less finished now. The ones that have endured are the ones that have been deemed successful. How do we define success, or how does the government do it? It's by patronage. It's by passengers carried. Is that the right question that we should be asking? Is that success? That success is relative to something, I guess. And are those passengers, are they coming from fixed route? Are they coming from the private car? Could we get even better passengers for better cost if we're going to do something else, like a reformed fixed route service, or maybe we subsidize Uber rides or Uber pool rides? A lot of questions that need to be considered, and we need to take a more mode agnostic view towards policy and planning of different modes. So as I mentioned, the measures of success, that subsidy of reduction is, and I see a lot of very relevant questions on that one, is extremely contentious, and it's because it's based on a counterfactual. What is that baseline level? Are we comparing to a fixed route? Are we comparing it to a bespoke community transport service? Are we comparing it to maybe the paratransit model in the US is very successful because there's an independent funding stream for folks with disability. The other, Rico asked that great question around the scalability challenges. The sort of evidence is that it's one of those things. It's like park and rides or bike racks on buses. It's successful until it becomes popular. When it's popular, it's unlike fixed route where you reap a lot of economies of scale and unit or marginal cost actually decreases. With if you want to maintain the same service levels with DRT, it rises exponentially. So that's a huge challenge, and you need to be managing stakeholder expectations because you'll be needing to constrain flexibility. There was a great experiment in Innisfil in Canada, which the town had a very underperforming sort of bus service, and it was all replaced by Uber and Uber pool services, and very quickly it became a lot more costly to run, and they actually had to cap the number of trips that citizens were able to use. So that's quite problematic. So that cliff that Juan talked about, potentially it is much lower than we actually think. Perhaps there's looking at a bus with carrying a lot of fresh air might not necessarily immediately warrant us doing something else about it. In my last section, I want to talk about some DRT strategies for Melbourne, bringing a lot of that together. I'm very fond of Melbourne. I relate very closely to Melbourne as one of the world's most livable cities, but also it's a city of stark contrast. You go to the outer suburbs and it's extremely hostile for pedestrians. I would say it is worse than Canberra and worse than Perth as well in terms of a lot of the urban design sort of challenges that are faced. And one of the big challenges we know is actually having bus services, public transport services keep up with developments on the metropolitan fringe. Too many places you're a couple of kilometers away from a nearest bus stop, and also even if there are buses, it comes 4 or 5 years too late when everyone's already bought their private car because they have no other choice. They're public transport deserts. So I think DRT is a really good way. It's a great use case or application for us to solve mobility challenges on the metropolitan fringe. What we can do is we can assign a standby DRT provider. It could be Move It, it could be anyone else by an open-ended process. You can put one in the southeast, the north, the western growth corridors, and implement DRT when new residents move in, because perhaps you don't want to run a bus service. The road infrastructure might not be fully built up. The place is still developing. The people aren't there. You don't want to run a bus service and then have to shift it a few streets later because government doesn't like to have losers in any of this. What's great about DRT, we saw the dashboards that were shared, is the ability to really actively monitor service performance and travel behavior. You have origin and destination points pretty much to the household, not at the stop level. You can test different pricing, you'll know where people go on a longer trip chain. And once you get to a mature stage of that development, you actually replace it with a fixed route offering, and you move that DRT, the vendor, and also the vehicles themselves to the next growth area. So that's a potential opportunity. Unlocking community assets is an important one when we're talking about these small vehicles. This gentleman he's a friend of mine. He's a stencil from the Point Cook Action Group, who started the Winbus DRT service a while ago. They moved to Tarnit and a few other places out in the western suburbs in terms of helping to serve those public transport deserts. But what they were able to do is bring together a lot of community transport assets, vehicles from the council, from operators from other places. Often their utilization is the inverse of typical peak patterns. So it's a very good way to actually unlock a lot of the synergies by just having people work together. So taking a modal agnostic way, modal harmonization is extremely important. We need to be deploying the right mode for the right geographic and temporal context, put each mode to their strength and provide efficient integration between different modes. We have continuing debate around the merits of infrastructure and service. Governments are more interested in ribbon cutting things where it is more of a bricks and mortar sort of environment than service. But we see a lot of controversy with station car parks, and we know the prices. This is from the National Audit report, but any sort of DRT, any fixed route, anything else that is service, I think in terms of providing a service would be far more cost effective, and certainly in terms of all the environmental, health and other externality benefits, far greater approach than car parks. The next point is actually about micromobility and about personal mobility devices, a lot of the new technologies that has been enabling. So in many ways, DRT is serving the same function as micromobility in terms of first and last mile trips, short trips, 2 or 3 kilometers. You're going to average a medium speed that micromobility will meet as well. So perhaps micromobility won't be for everyone, but there might be cases where micromobility is more suitable. And of course, micromobility is revenue generating for government in terms of the permit fees that are collected. There's no driver involved, so you're not going to need to fork out a lot of OPEX in that sense. So the way we actually design, procure these modes, we have one at the state level, one at local council level, I suppose, in terms of the RFPs that we know are online, even as we speak at the moment. a lot of opportunities to actually integrate that a lot better, and ensuring that micromobility isn't just in city centres and inner suburbs where there's already a lot of mobility options, but in some of the outlying areas where we really need public transport options. So taking on that total mobility approach to procurement, one of the, as I mentioned earlier, there actually is there's a lot of DRT operating, but under a different guise. In many ways, the shared ride-hailing model, the Uber pool, it's aggregating a number of trips onto a single vehicle. They're typically smaller vehicles like a car, but it's still be two or three trips. But it's operating commercially. It's operating out of the fare box, as opposed to a taxi ride that is subsidized. That's on a gross cost basis. The vehicles are fleet managed. There's scheduled workers and the like. So the commercial model, I think in many ways they serve the same function, even though they might not be designed as such. But the way we go about procuring it, or the way the prices are to the end user, is very different. So there might be opportunities to reform that. One is also requires that CPV levy as well, as opposed to others that are actually managed or regulated under the mode of bus. So taking on that, tackling these regulatory and procurement reforms is very important. I mentioned about those commercial DRT style services. Maybe we should be subsidizing them. Maybe they shouldn't be commercial. Maybe we should subsidize, and while we do that, we regulate it a lot better. We define areas of operation. We ensure better multimodal integration. We have data sharing requirements. So in the ride sharing space, there is hardly any. Whereas we go to micromobility, which is also open market in many ways, I guess. In terms of funding is concerned, there are very stringent requirements around things like that. And then maybe on the bus side with the other, there can be a bit of a convergence. We can be far more mode agnostic in terms of the way that we actually fund kilometers on the road, and operators can have that flexibility to deliver services using any mode of their choosing. So I point you to actually this book, available from all good bookstores. I might be a bit biased because I'm one of the co-authors, and one of the other co-authors are also on the call on this one. But there's a lot of roadmap in terms of how we can implement these mode agnostic mobility contracts into the future. And finally, sort of recapping and bringing all of that together towards better governance, we really do need to start at the upstream, whether it is around government objectives, the objectives of DRT, or it is around starting with network planning and ensuring DRT is on a reformed bus network rather than a simple overlay on something that exists already. We need to look at how we can endogenize integration, like a firm regulation as well. Regulation, the CPV, for instance, that $1.05, that's not something that's going to entice operators or drivers to deliver short trips, for instance, that are first and last mile to high capacity public transport, when that levy is going to be a far greater component of the revenue take. And again, lead to all of this, I think, is political will. We sort of know the best practice, the global state of play, the technologies. There's so much is going to be around government and governance being brave, tackling bigger challenges, so that we do ensure that we shape technology to fit society, rather than the other way around, as we have done for too long with private motor vehicles, the fossil fuel, auto dependence, urban sprawl, all the challenges that has brought for society. And in this really brave new world, this exciting time with these new technologies, we do very much need to make sure that they are fit for what we need as a community. So I'll finish off there. Thank you for your time, and back over to Christian.
Thanks, Jiao. It's been a really interesting and insightful presentation. I really will identify with those slides showing the paratransit, the informal transport in Africa, I think you mentioned. So because it's quite the same in Peru. We'll follow the agenda we had, so we will address the questions at the end of the session. So for our next presentation, I would like to introduce Peter Parker. Peter is a self-employed writer with 8 international successful books on specialty topics. He has had 14 years of employment experience in public transport, including both customer-facing and office roles. Until 2018, he was a bus network planner at the Victorian Department of Transport. As part of a small team, he helped develop a revised bus network for Melbourne's fast-growing western suburbs, including in the cities of Windham and Brisbane. Peter maintains Melbourne on Transit, a popular blog on the service aspect of public transport. I think the link is in the chat. Since 2019, he has been an active member of the Victorian Transport Action Group, an advocacy group comprised of transport and planning professionals, contributing to many of its policies papers. He can be found on Twitter at @melbontransit. Over to you, Peter.
Thanks, Christian, and good afternoon to everyone. And some common threads that I hope that I'll be able to add to. I'll just okay, the first thing I'll do is to start with a question. Have any of you stood back and reflected on the magic of urban transit? Here in Melbourne, you can pay a modest fare of $4.50 and someone will take you from Pakenham to Lara, that's near Geelong, or Melton to past Frankston. These are distances all over 80 kilometres from one side of Melbourne to the other. Your fare will max out at a still modest $9, no matter how you travel and how much you do in a day. And that's full fare. Concession is even less. That includes travel on trains, trams and buses, with no penalties for interchange between any of them. Vehicle purchase, operation and maintenance is looked after by others. You don't have to concentrate on driving, thus freeing your mind for other things. That can help offset one of public transport's disadvantages, and that is it sometimes takes longer than driving. Now, public transport not only has individual benefits, but also some community benefits. Some include lower emissions per passenger trip, foregone road congestion, better cities, and social inclusion. All are increasingly important as more of the world's population live in cities. Now, of course, there is one caveat in all this. If transit is poorly used, its benefits are less. Not only that, but its operating economies are worse, with less fare revenue. High productivity is absolutely key to getting all the benefits from public transport. So whatever we do, we need a network that can scale up in usage without dropping its bundle and becoming hopelessly slow. But not every mode or line needs identically high capacity. Hence, almost every big city will have high capacity trains fed by lower capacity buses. Together, they can move hundreds of thousands, if not millions per day. Now, the most productive transport networks don't just run their trains and buses mostly during peak hour, but frequently all day. Buses tend to feed rather than parallel trains to form a grid. These features make public transport useful for diverse trips, not just during the now diminished CBD commute. Other cities have reformed their networks and timetables accordingly, and I think there's big opportunities for Australian cities, particularly Melbourne, Brisbane and Adelaide, to step up on service reform. Then we have taxis and rideshare. Their drivers can't deliver as many passenger trips per hour as a bus or train driver can. Hence, taxis and rideshare are only viable if they charge much more than $4.50 per trip. In return, though, the passenger gets a point-to-point ride. But unless they're rich, they won't be able to afford taxis for routine daily trips. So there's a limit to scalability there as well. So where does mobility as a service fit in? I think of it like a buffet with many available dishes. Its promoters hope that if we change the buying and payment method, then fewer people will pick the one called full-time car ownership and use. Success here, though, assumes that the other dishes are tasty enough and that they don't cost too much to cook and serve to masses of people. And that's an important point, masses of people. Bear that in mind in the next few minutes. Flexible route buses is one of the menu's items and what I'll talk about today. In the new data-driven world, we're told that they'll replace some existing timetabled buses. The latter get a bad name, particularly here in tram-crossed Melbourne. Common concerns include noise, CO2 emissions, indirect routes, and services too infrequent to be useful. Another thing is that people in the suburbs say that they don't like big diesel buses in their little streets. Won't someone think of the children? Even though many households in them may own one, or more likely two, increasingly large SUVs with fronts even taller than children. A comment you often hear is that the big buses are carrying only a few people and that it would be better replacing them with little buses, only turning into the street if there are passengers. I'll give you some numbers on bus occupancies and productivity later. Now, as mentioned in the previous talk, transport departments have long seen flexible buses as something we should have more of. Bus plans in 1988, 2006, and this year all proposed flexible routes to replace some fixed routes. Right now, a brand called FlexiRide is being rolled out to describe this breed of service. The brand may be new, but the concept isn't. Melbourne started flexible routes before many of you were born. As mentioned, John Usher and Telebus. Melbourne's newest FlexiRide, introduced 3 weeks ago around Chirnside Park, replaces the dial-a-ride flexible route Telebus from the 1970s. The main difference is that FlexiRide has fewer fixed stops and has an app. This is separate from the main PTV app. Hence, users need storage space in their phones for 2 transport apps instead of 1. What happened to simple connected journeys, which was the Department of Transport's mantra? Nevertheless, I have had a go and using FlexiRide and can talk about that. What are they like to use? Well, the slide summarises it. And are they really a transport solution for dispersed suburbs, despite my good experience? And do they scale up so they can benefit many people? And if they don't, what can? Answers to all these and more today. Now, what you're seeing on the screen is a map of the Rowville area, which is covered by the FlexiRide that was introduced about 10 months or so ago. And of course, the first thing you might notice if your screen's really high resolution is it doesn't say FlexiRide on the map. It still says Telebus. And yes, there are still some issues with the Department of Transport, their administration, their coordination of services, their accuracy of maps. Yep, if you're to look at a local area route map for the Knox Council area, it still has the Telebuses and not the FlexiRide. So there's still some institutional difficulties in introducing FlexiRide. The Department of Transport can't quite get it all right and accurate. Yet another page on their website does explain it with a map, but they haven't seen to put that onto the local area map. Anyway, an interesting thing is there's a few facts there. You can see the shops at Stud Park, the station in the top right, which is Ferntree Gully, and all this serves roughly 40,000 population. There are 2 frequent bus routes in the Rowville area, both in the extreme west of the suburb, one coming from Caulfield, the 900, and the 901 north-south. The other bus routes in the area, at best, they might be every 40 minutes, other times 90 minutes, with, as you can see, quite indirect. Anyway, I went to Rowville and tested FlexiRide. And if you haven't been there, I suggest you do. 1990s outer suburb, built when there was pretty much almost no money for local buses, and no one's seen fit to do much in the decades since. neither has anything come of various train line promises that various vote-buying politicians. In fact, you almost have to promise a train and not deliver it to qualify as a politician. Anyway, there's history of that on my blog. And anyway, so all they've got is infrequent fixed routes and flexible routes. The latter of which is the Flexi Ride, which replaced the Roeville Telebus. First of all, I found the Flexi Ride fantastic. The experience was repeated for several trips on different days. Provided, of course, I started at Stud Park or Ferntree Gully Station. If you were to make a trip from one in-between location to another in-between location, then I don't think Flexi Ride is set up for that. But for trips going to those main nodes, then it was fantastic. Every time I'd summon a bus on the app, it was there in a few minutes. Very much a turn up and go. That was my experience. And that tallied with data that the operator presented at last week's Melbourne Transport Forum, MTF Love Buses. In fact, that's now on the web, so I'd recommend looking at that, MTF Love Buses. There's some presentations, including a great one on the Flexi Ride. And the other thing is that was great was the travel time was like driving. And I think that compares favourably with the old Telebus, which had set hourly departures and a surcharge if it deviated from its fixed route. Now, not once, though, did I see another passenger on it. It was like having a private driver at my beck and call. From my selfish point of view, it seemed almost too good to be true. And maybe it is if someone else is picking up the tab. It's common for untold roads and public transport on Mikey fares to get a public subsidy. But my Flexi Ride trips, with no other passenger but me, must have meant a higher subsidy than riders on other buses, including the fixed route I took to reach Roeville. Of course, you could try increasing the fares to make the finances look better, but then you'd be destroying multi-mode fare integration and discourage ridership. Lower ridership is bad for productivity and thus all the benefits of public transport I mentioned before. Interestingly, Infrastructure Victoria also want to disintegrate fares, but they want bus fares to be lower rather than higher to encourage bus ridership. Now, I didn't have the boardings per numbers for Roeville Flexi Ride, but there was a media release that came out that mentioned 117 people per day earlier this year, I believe with 4 buses. Now, if you multiply that by 6 days per week, then because the bus only runs 6 days per week, then that's about 36,000 passengers per year. Now, of course, that means Roeville and Listerfield have about that as their population. So at this stage, it's like one person takes 1 bus trip per year. So only a tiny percentage of residents use the bus, and I think it's even less than in other car-dominated suburbs. Another thing that's worth looking at is we don't know whether Flexi Ride has reduced patronage on fixed routes. You can see on the map, they're still there, 681, 682 and 691. They heavily overlap the Flexi Ride area. Personally, if I was in the area, I would take a Flexi Ride rather than a fixed route because those routes are generally quite infrequent. And if we compare with other bus routes in Melbourne, we have other routes, quite short routes, with a single bus that carry 70 to 100,000 passengers per year, which exceeds the entire Roeville Flexi Ride system. So even with a bit of growth, even if it doubled, then Roeville Flexi Ride would still be quite lowly used compared with fixed routes in other areas. So that's just something to bear in mind. It's also worth looking at telebus versus fixed routes in similar areas. These are late 2018 figures, so predate COVID. I've looked at both Lilydale and Roeville area. The column on the left is the fixed routes, and the number in brackets is the Monday to Friday boardings per service hour. The average for Melbourne is a bit over 20 boardings per hour. So there's some fixed routes that actually do quite well, especially in the Lilydale area. Infrastructure Victoria have written various papers. They say that if a bus is more than 20 boardings per hour, then it's considered a productive route. So there are some bus routes that are quite near there. If you look on the right-hand column, the telebuses, the numbers are very low, particularly for Rowville. So even if you were to double them, they're quite low patronage. The Lilydale telebus did a bit better. That was the original telebus that was put in. I think it might have an older population skew. It's more established. There's possibly also fewer bus routes that duplicate some of the telebus areas. But overall, the telebus routes are less productive, even in a similar area, than fixed routes. And even telebus, as I mentioned before, has a bit of a fixed route component. There are certain stops in the middle of the route that the bus would always serve. So it was a bit of a hybrid thing between a fixed route and a flexible route bus. And there's a risk that a flexible route bus may be even lower in some areas than those figures you see for telebus. Though it would seem that for Rowville, the flexi ride's doing better than the telebus, which was doing quite poorly anyway. So why don't our flexible route buses seem to do so well? There's some issues, like you could argue that the operating hours, you still don't have, because it's cost neutral, flexi ride don't operate on Sundays. They finish earlier at night compared with regular bus routes. They're not up to the minimum standards for buses in most other suburbs. But another issue is possibly because flexible routes are less scalable. Now consider if there was another passenger already on the bus. Instead of me being the only passenger, there is someone else there. Anyway, if the bus had to deviate for me, then that other person's trip would be several minutes longer. If a third passenger boarded later, then both the first passenger and me would have a slower trip. So it sort of snowballs. Maybe it's still bearable with 3 passengers on the bus, but as you add more people, the delay snowballs. Then the trip wouldn't be anywhere near as quick and reliable as it would have been with just me. So especially with the sort of street patterns you have in areas like Rowville, Churnside Park, very, very convoluted. So if you, now this is quite important, particularly in an area like Rowville. If you wanted to go to an appointment or meet a train, you need reliability, not volatility. When someone talks about flexibility, you must always ask, on whose terms? It might not be the customer's. And that's what we've got to be very mindful of. And it was good that we heard before of the monitoring of customer feedback for that. In Rowville, if you miss a train at your nearest station of Ferntree Gully, off-peak, it's 30 minutes to the next one. Adelaide and Brisbane also have a lot of half-hourly trains. Peri-urban stations get even less service. The variability that a well-used flexible route can introduce is not your friend if you want reliable all-day connections. Note that I did say well-used. If there's little use and the bus comes quickly and the journey times are fast, then because you're the only one on it, that's why the journey times are fast, because the bus goes direct to your destination. But get a few passengers and the reliability drops sharply. When that happens, people stop using the bus, so usage might stabilize at a low level, not particularly productive, that involves a high subsidy per passenger, which makes for terrible economics with high opportunity costs. And remember what I said before about productivity being key. Now, what about fixed route timetabled buses? They can be scheduled to connect reliably with infrequent trains. This reliability comes from the bus going the same way for each trip. Also important is that extra passengers add only slightly more trip time. This is because the bus only has to slow and stop rather than deviate off the road for someone and maybe come back to where they started. Where the bus is already stopping for one passenger, the added time for extra boardings is only a matter of seconds. That compares to the minutes it could be for an extra passenger on a flexible routes that need to deviate. The graph that you see gives a bit of an idea. The red line is the flexible type route. The blue line is the fixed route. With very small numbers of passengers, the flexible route may be faster, but as the numbers of passengers increase, because each passenger adds much less time to the overall runtime, the fixed route starts to come into its own. So when I talk about scaling up, flexible routes might not be so good when you're trying to scale up. And of course, when there's not many passengers on the bus, the economics are poor. Now, if you do get more passengers attracted by how wonderful the flexi ride is in its early days, then reliability will start to get worse. And then you miss more train connections. Then to compensate, patronage might also fall and punctuality might improve. Now, you could argue that this is self-correcting, but it's really not a recipe for growth if you believe, as I do, in the large economic, social and environmental benefits of well-used transit. So, what are some alternatives? I've described my recent experience with FlexiRide. It's been wonderful, but I think there's some more broadly applicable lessons. If you want to reconcile productivity and economics, even in car-dominant outer suburbs, then fixed route buses may still be pretty good options for providing a service, especially if thought is given to network reform. And we can't just say it's too hard. We can't just outsource it to someone with an app and the Department of Transport abrogate their responsibility, which frankly is what they've been doing for quite a few years, for quite a long time. They've got to wake up to themselves on that, especially since they're the one that's paying the bills and they also have a vested interest in high productivity. The first priority, I think, is to reform the most productive part of the network first. Precisely because it's the most productive, this costs the least per passenger to maintain or improve services. Your aim should be to make such a productive network as widely accessible as possible. In areas like Rowville and Lilydale, maybe we have to think about boosting train frequencies so that they are better than half-hourly off-peak. That benefits a catchment measured in hundreds of thousands, including people all the way through Ringwood, Box Hill, a lot of other areas. If you had trains every 20 minutes to the end of the Belgrave and Lilydale line, which would benefit both Rowville and Lilydale, then you've got a huge benefit across the whole eastern part of the Melbourne suburbs, huge catchments. And that's got big implications all around, not just in low density outer suburbs. And you've got a benefit to a catchment in the hundreds of thousands. That also permits greater scheduling flexibility for reformed and more frequent local bus networks. So you could have buses running every 20 minutes rather than every 30 minutes, whereas now if you were to put those in, they would miss trains. After that, you could reform local buses. There are bus routes in Melbourne's outer east, including in Rowville, that haven't been properly reformed for decades. Timetables may still reflect 1980s shopping hours, like no Saturday afternoon service. New routes like FlexiRide might have been overlaid on older unreformed routes. And that, I think, is to the productivity detriment of them both, along with making operations more expensive than it should be. Now, I think in this, the Department of Transport got the order wrong. They should have reformed fixed route buses before introducing FlexiRide. That's because with a reformed local route network, that may extend coverage to areas that no longer need flexible route buses. That could have enabled better efficiency and less duplication. Another outcome is that both Rowville and Lilydale currently have two half networks. Both operate over limited hours, both not well used as they could be. Not really an alternative for people with a car or thinking of buying their next one. When the Department of Transport changed Telebus to FlexiRide, it did nothing with the existing fixed routes. In Lilydale, it did slightly more, but still very little. There've also been complex occasional extensions and deviations on the existing bus route, again, not reformed. The flexible routes overlap the fixed routes and don't run Sundays. That's because the FlexiRide replaced the previous Telebus that also didn't run Sundays. And there is the issue of the limitation of being cost neutral. But if they were able to reform the fixed routes as well, maybe there would have been a bit more flexibility to have delivered a better 7-day service. Both types of routes, the FlexiRide and the fixed routes, are daytime only, and some of them don't run Sundays, but not public holidays. It's a strange quirk with the timetable. And yeah, so basically there's a lot of opportunity to do better. There are some other things you might be able to do. And to sum up, a daytime shopper route could provide some mobility for pockets that don't justify a full bus service. There might be potential for subsidy taxi arrangements. Yeah, I think we can look at cities like Sydney, Perth, and Auckland that have reformed their regular fixed routes first. I think, though, there's scope for optimism. The Department of Transport are starting to think about serious bus reform, so hopefully we're starting to turn the corner. My final thoughts are to think about productivity. I'm not saying that demand responsive is bad, but you should be very alive as to its opportunity to scale things up. The proof of success is in the service and not the app. Whatever delivers the best service to the most people is key to maximising the individual and societal benefits that public transport offers. So that's my thoughts. Some more information on the Rowville and Lilydale telebuses on my blog, melbourneontransit.blogspot. So that brings us to the end.
Thanks, Peter. Thank you very much. Well, we will now begin the Q&A session. So there are some questions in the chat for Yale. Let me go through it. So there's a question from Professor Henscher. DRT can serve the social excluded much better than regular PT. What do you think? If so, then the value of it must be different, since we know that an additional trip by socially excluded people has a higher monetary value than the average trip as shown by Stanley and Henscher. So a passenger is not a passenger.
Thanks, Christian. It's there's a lot of great questions in the chat box. I might take that one and also a couple of the next few, because I do have another call at 6 o'clock and then non-stop till 9 o'clock this evening, unfortunately. So I'll quickly go through the social exclusion is a major issue. That piece of research from Stanley and Henscher. So John Stanley was the former executive director of the Bus Association Victoria, and also he led the National Transport Commission about a decade or two ago. So very distinguished people. The social exclusion is I think it was valued at something like $60 a trip. So when we compare to other ways of if it's a value of travel time savings or some other metrics, that I think that there are some changes. The big nuance, I think, with the social exclusion, a lot of I believe that was found linked to this one is actually amongst young people. It's amongst young people who didn't have access to an automobile. It's not really the people with limited mobility. So in case there's people that are able, it is a case of there being no public transport available. So having a fixed route solution, regardless of cognizant of everything that we've been discussing, is not unsuitable. Whereas if it's it's less mobile people, then yes, DRT may well be the only solution, but it has to be priced and remunerated properly, and it has to be, we talk about user side subsidies. For instance, it needs to be linked properly in terms of purpose. The whole value chain from the planning, funding, finance, procurement, everything down to that customer experience. The next one from Glenn. I apologize if I monopolize this just briefly. I think there's a lot of including the flexi ride one. They did try to look for electric solutions. At the moment, there aren't too many electric small mini bus vehicles on the market. There are a few, but certainly not yet sort of proven in the Australian market. So that one is an emerging space, I think. And the other with autonomous, we see a lot of the shuttles running around doing trials in a lot of other countries. In China, they're very well advanced. People don't do closed trials anymore. That's something from maybe 3 or 5 years ago. But there is a lot of scope and opportunity in those serving those communities, and where you don't have the labour component, it becomes far more of a feasible proposition. And the second one about disability sort of compliance, about easy access. The issue has been, you'll see in the picture with the New South Wales trials, because there have been trials. I think there's some exemption around the DDA compliance requirements. But these days, I think that there's a multitude of products out there. The Hino Poncho, for instance, is a well-used vehicle that runs around that Japanese kind of body that is able to accommodate all those access requirements. And then just a final one from Dr. Michael Kennedy in terms of, I think the first one's a bit of a comment, and the second one in terms of political will. Look, I think the story with FlexiRide, with Roville, it's a bit of a sad story, I guess, but there wasn't any political will to give them a proper bus service. But there is political will to provide something that's technology first. So because of the excitement, something sexy, like an app, it oftentimes is quite closely linked to that. I can make plenty of other sort of comparisons. I think where governments, there's plenty of examples where there are excellent bus networks that have been put out, including in Melbourne, and I think Point Cook is actually a pretty good one. If the performance of individual routes actually quite high there. So there was the will to invest. You'll see the service levels. A lot of them, they have late night Friday, Saturday services. They more than exceed the typical policy headways that you'll see in other places. The spacing aren't too bad. The issue there has been, it was a bit of a set and forget kind of thing. The last reform was 5 years ago, and there's been so much development, especially in the western fringes of that state community, that network planning has to be a systematic thing where every year you do something. Maybe every quarter you tweak running times, and then yearly you do something. You make more broader sort of changes, and then later you do larger scale kind of changes. But we need to have a timetable in place to make sure everything's. There's a very inconsistent approach. A lot of places have they have had these recoordination, these network reforms. They're in selected pockets. There's no transparency in terms of how that is selected in different communities across Melbourne. Some places they've just had a reform, and then a few years later they're going to have another one. There are other communities, Roville, for example, that haven't had one for 40 years. So much is down to, I think, that purpose and governance that is, less politicized, more sort of level-headed and demand-driven, I guess. So, my 2 cents for those questions there. And I do apologize, I will need to drop off now. But thank you again for the invitation, and great to be.
Thank you, Liel.
So many ITE people.
Accepting. Yeah. Thank you very much. We have some other questions. Maybe you, Peter, can answer them. It says, based on the concerns with flexible route buses, and therefore there was a greater travel time for the buses, would a solution not be introducing another bus, thus ensuring fixed transit schedules are still aligned with travel considerations for those being collected?
I would be inclined to think that might be an opportunity to reform the network, because I think if you just throw more buses on a flexible route buses, and bearing in mind that you'll have quite poor performance at quite low amounts of patronage, that I don't think is really acceptable, and poor value for money as well. So I'd be looking at the scope to make it a bit less, the route a bit less flexible, and move towards a fixed route type for that area. So that will enable better reliability, and maybe you might still have a flexible route in the area, but it might be confined to a smaller area with a smaller number of buses, while there's greater emphasis put on an improved fixed route for more of the area, because there's sort of an evolution of development of transport networks. You could argue that the flexible routes, like the least developed, then you get to things like fixed routes, then more frequent fixed routes, then bus priority, bus lanes, bus rapid transit, and then you've got a really fast direct type service. So arguably a fixed route is an advance on a flexible route. When patronage gets above, I think it's quite a low level. And I think that is the approach that should be done.
Mm-hmm. And is there any evidence for Philip asked if there is any evidence yet that the residents of Rowville are aware of the DRT services, because most of the people there use cars by default because they live in Rowville. Have they been pestered to try using buses at all, or a frequent or unreasonably direct link to the GTF station would be useful to commuters?
Yeah, I think there's a risk because with the flexible route buses, given that if you increase their patronage a little bit, then if your wait times blow out, then there's a risk of having an advertising campaign, and then if too many people respond, then they're disappointed by the service. That deteriorates greatly when the number of people on it increases. And that point is reached much earlier with a flexible route than with a fixed route. So there's a degree of political risk, and arguably if you promote a service, it's not up to people's expectations and they stop using it. That could arguably be more detrimental than not promoting it. So there's a risk. I think flexible routes have a greater risk than fixed routes on this.
Yeah, and it has been there any example for like a mixture between fixed roads and flexible or flexi ride in Australia? For example, fixed roads during peak times and flexi ride and flexible roads during off peak.
Yeah, there's an interesting case. In fact, the Route 672, which was part of the recent changes that was exactly that case. It was a fixed route, but off-peak it had a flexible, a telebus component. And the most recent reform, in fact, this happened on the same day that the Lilydale Flexi Ride started, was they'd say, no, we'll make it consistent and we'll make it a fixed route all the time, including off-peak. So if anything, we've gone away from that. And one of the criticisms that people have of buses in Melbourne is that they are complex, they have these deviations that people don't understand where they go, and introducing that sort of extra complexity, I don't think is necessarily a good thing. And our busiest and most well-used routes are those that are consistent and frequent with no variations. So I think that should be the aim.
Right. Yeah, because most of the people don't need a flexible ride on the journey to work because they go to work at the same time every day, maybe. Okay.
Well, I'm not sure about that. Like the modern labour market is, especially with the fall off in CBD type office employment, the modern labour market is moving towards more part-time casual, and that might include a lot of the younger people, even some of the socially disadvantaged people in casual work. And as it stands, Flexi Ride doesn't run on Sundays, and for people in retail, that's a deal breaker. So you have to think about what is the network that can deliver the best operating hours and the best frequency over as many hours of the day as possible. And that will capture a lot, not all, but a lot of the social inclusion concerns.
Okay, yeah. There is a one last question. It seems DRT only works where cost to customer equals public transport, while service standard equals Uber. Is a sweet spot achievable?
I'm not sure if I understand the question. Like,
oh, I can. I can repeat the question, or can you see it on the chat?
Yeah.
Or maybe James, I think it's online. You can ask the question. I think your microphone is not working. No. Yeah, it's not working. Or it's only me. Can you? No, it's not working.
Like you could argue that, once, in terms of sweet spots and things, since DRT can have a high subsidy per passenger. Part of it is depends on the customer. If the customer is willing to walk a bit and you're able to provide a fixed route network, maybe one that's more frequent than current, that's something that Rowville Listerfield doesn't have. Like, except for those right near Stud Road, they do not, even on the main roads, they do not have frequent networks. In some cases, people are willing to walk further to a more frequent long hours route, and for some people, that might be a better trade-off, a better type of public transport. Other people who aren't able to walk or might really want door-to-door travel, then maybe taxis and Ubers, but they have to pay more. Maybe that's the option for them. But for a public transport system that tries to do a lot of trips and not just off-peak shopper trips, then you need your good hours and good operating frequencies, which aren't provided by either public transport option in places like Rowville, which is why their overall patronage is so poor.
Okay, yeah. I think we ran out of time. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, everyone that has attended. We really appreciate it. I just want to mention we have two following events: the President's Dinner that is held in the 16th of November, and we have a road and safety star ratings and application of house wrap on the 25th of November. Thank you very much to everyone, and stay safe, and see you next time.